The Long Road to Mandalore, RK Part 3, RK Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Lantilles, the Separatists surprised me. So much in fact that I spent the next few seconds simply staring at the tactical plot and wondering the hell was their commander thinking. A single battle group appeared in front of us, danger close, and was immediately engaged by my ships. Not a single enemy ship went after our flanks. Instead, despite all the ECM, jamming and weapon fire interference, the sensors managed to pick up a second Reaper element appearing after the first. Two more didn't vanish from the long-range sensors, which meant that the last one was behind those in front of us. The daggers and silencers took a frightful toll upon the enemy munificence, with the latter firing first and blowing apart the bulk of Reaper 3's escorts. The destroyers accounted for 4 more, with the last one missing a wildly evasive frigate. That left 4 battleships flying right in the teeth of my battle line. Concentrated firepower stripped their deflectors in a short order while the daggers finished off the remaining munificence and retargeted upon the enemy capital ships. The Separatists in turn concentrated their own firepower upon one of my Venottas and burned through the cruiser's shields easier than they should have. Too much accumulated battle damage was the most likely answer. Then, before they were silenced, those battle wagons managed to slag close to half of the glorious armor and remaining weapons. As we entered into the shattered remains or Reaper 3, Reaper 4 opened fire, seeking my silencers and daggers. The enemy's tactic was clear and effective if overly wasteful. They sacrificed a lot of their ships to locate my most dangerous units, and now they were about to throw everything they had against the silencers. Reaper 4 bore at us at full military thrust with 6 close on their heels. I was sure that shortly, the 2 formations currently held back would jump at us too. The silencers spoke again, more munificence died, thus greatly mitigating the odds of a successful enemy ramming attack. The Separatist battleships concentrated their firepower at the Brave, the superweapon mounting Venator at the bottom of my formation. Due to relative positions and where the weapon itself was mounted, it meant that it was vulnerable. Before the cruiser could seal its hangar and thus cover the silencer, the battleships managed to cause enough damage to cause a spot failure in the deflector, and a few turbolaser bolts passed through before one of Brave's consorts managed to cover her. A single shot slipped through the closing doors, and a few seconds later the status of the cruiser changed, announcing that the silencer was out of action. In retaliation, the daggers and my cruisers knocked off the remaining battleships from Reaper 4. That was just in time for Reaper 6 to come to grips with us, and the enemy chose that moment to jump in its remaining 2 battle groups. They appeared on our flanks, and this time they were both in the correct position. Cover our remaining silencers as a priority. Emergency acceleration. We're going through the enemy in front of us and making a tactical jump. 3 silencers weren't enough to take most Reaper 6's escorts. Not even the daggers helped in that respect. To complicate things, we were just passing through Reaper 4's broken hulks when the enemy in front of us reached our formation. With cruisers maneuvering to cover critical units and debris in the way, properly concentrating firepower upon the incoming enemy became much, much harder. A munificence slammed into the top of a Venator as the cruiser moved to avoid a wrecked enemy battleship. The collision was enough to push her into the battle wagon's hulk, and the 3 warships vanished as one of their hypermatter reactors went critical. When the blinding glare of the explosion cleared, only an expanding cloud of small debris remained in its wake. Close to 10,000 souls snuffed like it was nothing. Dagger herself, the namesake and fist of the Dagger-class destroyers, went up next. Reaper 6's battleships concentrated their guns on her after the silencer-equipped cruiser on the top of our formation got physically covered by her consorts before her special weapon could be damaged. Dagger found herself in the worst type of fight for her, against ships that outclassed her by orders of magnitude in armor and weaponry. While her defenses were respectable, at point-blank range they could do little against 3 battleships. Her escorts tried their best. One of those Venottas covered her bodily, however it wasn't enough. Her deflectors failed, the comparatively light armor boiled away, and she flew away out of control with all external systems gone and most decks open to space. On the flanks, Our escorts threw themselves at the advancing enemy with a suicidal oberdone. 30 seconds passed between the appearance of the Reaper formations around us and the time we broke through Reaper 6 and could jump away. In that time, every single of our remained escorts died, with no less than 10 of them going for a suicidal ramming attack against munificence determined to do the same to our cruisers. Not a single of those succeeded. However, they, along with the battleships in those two formations, managed to pass by multiple Venatas close enough for them to strip their shields from sheer proximity before shooting at each other at point-blank range. A few months ago, such a maneuver, provided it avoided collision, would have hugely favored our side, though mind you, it would still have been a bad, desperate idea. Today, armor and weapons that had been patched up one many times gave under the strain. Overstressed and damaged sensor clusters overloaded, and one after another damaged ships lost acceleration and began falling out of formation. The fleet kept pushing through and hammering every single enemy unit that came into range. Reaper 6's battleships got the worst of that exchange. However, by the time our formations stripped off their weapons and most of their armor, they managed to damage multiple cruisers as they had to pass too close to them. Finally, we jumped away, breaking the engagement and buying ourselves a few minutes of respite. I checked the clock. 5 minutes until the supply ships arrived. We had to engage the enemy at least one more time to buy them the time they would need to go into position for a transit to Giza. Joanna, give me a status of the fleet, ASAP. The tactical plot was radically changed. While we reduced the enemies present in the system to a third of their original numbers, our escorts were gone and almost a quarter of our battle line was left behind due to battle damage. Numerically, our forces were about equal, with us having the advantage in tonnage. However, 2 silencers were out of action and I didn't even notice the second being taken out. 1 dagger was gone, with another suffering enough damage to knock out her railgun until she saw a dock. And every single ship we had left had suffered some additional damage. If another enemy force arrived, we might have to abandon the supply ships to fend off for themselves, and in that case, the loss of the only people experienced in producing the silencers was going to hurt. I glared at the tactical plot. This was why I hated close-range engagements. They tended to be short and very bloody for everyone concerned, even when the enemy didn't have a fetish for ramming your ships. =RK equals Part 4 =RK equals Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Lantilles. I listened with half an ear as damage reports continued to arrive. The little staff we hadn't cannibalized for command personnel was busy refining the information, and thus steadily the friendly icons on the tactical plot changed coloration and, when zoomed in, now displayed a brief summary on how badly my fleet got mauled. A great deal of the progress fixing damage during the respite after Bothoy got erased, with a long list of new broken things in need of fixing sooner rather than later added to the DC party's to-do list. We got hurt, badly, General. Joanna spoke from the CIC. We can take the remaining enemy forces, perhaps what they have at Giza too. However, when that's done, this fleet will be spent, there's no doubt about it. My eyes flickered back to the tactical display. Joanna was right. There was no way in hell I could justify bringing what would remain of the fleet to Mandalore. Perhaps a few ships in better condition, and after some extensive emergency repairs at a proper naval facility, the 2 remaining silencer-equipped ones and the daggers came to mind. If I could preserve them until we reached safety, I would need more ships to liberate Mandalore. It wasn't until this moment that the truth sunk in. A few minutes of vicious fighting guaranteed that any hopes I had of heading back to Mandalore soon would at best be contingent on what forces could be spared when we got to a Republic naval station. It was a bitter, infuriating realization. It made my blood boil in impotent fury. Bringing our support ships back safely just became that much more vital. With the mobile dock and its experienced crews, we could have a new production run of silencers ready much faster than otherwise, and that was something that suddenly jumped up on the top of my immediate priorities list. The silencers. Joanna immediately concluded. After all, she just witnessed firsthand how useful they could be even in tactical situations that didn't play to their strengths. Correct. We're engaging the remaining separatist forces in system the moment we complete our turn, then the fleet will fall back into a defensive formation along with the support ship's escorts. If practical, we'll request that our forces at Geyser and Tanab launch a raid to recover as many of the damaged ships and crews we're leaving behind. Those able are to head for Lantilles and try landing in friendly territory. We aren't staying to recover survivors. Joanna frowned. We can't take the risk. For all we know, heavy enemy reinforcements are on the way here as we speak. I didn't need to point out that we weren't in a position to handle a large fresh force. The separatist fleet supposedly raiding Geyser would be a stretch if we had to face it in case our forces there hadn't bloodied it. She wasn't happy about my order. I wasn't happy either. Leaving people behind was bad for morale and fleet cohesion. It was what many a Sith I despised would have done without a second thought. Shift formation to Besh 3 and have a jump calculated for Reaper 1. I ordered. That formation was a modified phalanx meant to cover the silencers and daggers by placing them in the center of our fleet. It was the best I could do with the assets I had left. The total destruction of our escorts during the previous engagement was going to hurt now. The only silver lining was that the enemy hadn't deployed swarms of small craft. Initially, that wasn't much of a surprise. The separatists' vultures lacked hyperdrives and that made them much harder to utilize in conjunction with sub-formations making constant hyperspace jumps all over the battlescape. The time it would take to launch and recover them could add an unacceptable delays unless said vultures got abandoned after first deployment, not to mention that the Guardian system was in place to mitigate their effects anyway. As it turned out, even if they wanted to, the enemy in system couldn't throw swarms of the pests at us, at least according to Commander Nabi. All enemy small craft were deployed planet-side as air superiority and support assets, which was a small mercy for us, though the local PDF and any clones down there would disagree, possibly violently at that. I concentrated on the two remaining separatist formations. They declined to combine in a single larger fleet, which while a double-edged sword was ominous. Ever since I became a part of this war, the enemy usually went with simple, basic tactics. It was to be expected. It has been a very long time since anyone had the reason, means or resources to throw around fleets as large as seen in this war. Maintaining big standing forces was expensive, training them to the standards needed for a proper galaxy-wide war with all that entailed, more so. A vital edge of experience had been lost in the last 1,000 years of peace, perhaps longer than that. Unfortunately, the enemy was learning. I only hoped that the Republic Navy was doing the same, because if they didn't and continued to rely on the single ponderous formations that were the golden standard when I arrived, the separatists would gain a vital tactical edge if what I was seeing today was anything to go by. To my experienced eyes it was clear that the enemy was still stumbling his way into properly utilizing multiple battle groups for well-organized and coordinated highly mobile warfare. Most damning, even as they suffered losses, their commander didn't revert to simpler tactics, instead they continued to try make things work and they were improving. Hopefully we would be able to destroy the enemy force in this system, and it would be even better if the separatist commander not only did go down with their fleet but failed to transmit tactical information of this battle to his or her superiors. However, that was a wishful thinking I couldn't count on. I had to assume that the enemy was going to learn from everything that happened and was yet to happen today, and I would have to be prepared for them to demonstrate the benefits of those lessons at Mandalore and any consequent battle of the war. We managed to complete our turn a bit faster than the enemy thanks to our Venottas being more agile than the separatist battleships. While that fact bought us less than a minute, even such a small window of time could be precious if you had the tools to utilize it right. Calculations in. Entering hyperspace. Joanna announced, a brief flicker of stretching stars and a glimpse of the energy realm allowing us faster than light travel, and we appeared at Reaper 1's flank, putting them between us and the other enemy battle group. Engage at will. Emergency deceleration. Shift vectors as needed to keep Reaper 1 between us and their friends. I rattled a string of orders. The silencers spoke and multiple munificents broke apart in multicolored explosions. More died targeted by the daggers and seconds later under a turbo laser barrage. The enemy wasted no time and accelerated, with Reaper 1 showing the same suicidal determination as the rest of the Separatist fleet in this system. In another time I would have respected those crews' Durasteel discipline and belief in their cause. Almost any conceivable organic force would have balked and likely broken after suffering over 60% casualties in minutes. The droids, on the other hand, they didn't have such a problem. They would keep coming as long as they were ordered to. As the range fell to point blank and Munificent swarmed towards us coming into ram, I unleashed the missile stocks we got from Gord. The distance between the fleets was negligible now, munition flight time measured in seconds at worst. Jamming, interference produced by shields and both sides' firepower in such a confined space served to further degrade PD performance. Crude, yet powerful fusion and proton-tipped missiles flew at the approaching frigates, and while counterfire swatted a lot of them out of space anyway, only a few needed to slip through to ruin a frigate's day. Nuclear detonations boiled away armor, fried sensors and irradiated hulls. Weapons got fused to the hull if not outright blasted away, engines went critical and blew away in sympathetic explosions, railgun rounds sheared through light ships as if their armor wasn't even there. It wasn't enough. The enemy gave as good as it got on the way in. Shield emitters that saw one too many engagements without replacement malfunctioned, deflectors weakened, manifested spot failures before their control systems could compensate or failed outright. Armor belts patched up multiple times broke under barrages that they would have been able to handle a few months ago, and weapon emplacements lost in previous battles compromised the ability of ships to fend off the incoming kamikazes. It was at this point that our dead escorts would have shined, distracting, engaging and physically intercepting the rushing enemy, if all else failed. 10 munificents broke through everything my battered fleet could throw at them. Half of them got swatted away by last-ditch defensive fire, if not from their targets, then by their consorts. The remaining 5, damaged, burning and dying, managed to reach an equal number of my cruisers, and all but a pair of them vanished in short-lived pyres of mutual annihilation. Only a single Venator got lucky, with the munificent intent or ramming her breaking apart moments before collision. The resulting impacts totaled her whole dorsal side, yet a lot of the crew lived to reach any and all available escape pods and shuttles. The silencers and daggers softened up the enemy battleships, and we lost only 4 more cruisers as battered wrecks that could no longer be useful in fight. Then the last enemy force in system jumped right on top of us and all hell broke loose. The long road to Mandalore =RK=, Part 5 =RK=, Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Lantilles. When last Reaper element engaged us, I allowed myself to manifest my battle meditation. My whole body ached with the strain of channeling the necessary power, and my mind wasn't much better. Everything I've been through since arriving to this time left a mark upon me. I had to rely too much on my powers, without sufficient time to recover, nor access to the artifacts and facilities needed to help me. In such circumstances, every little bit helped, like being on the open and vulnerable observation lounge. Standing in a place so open to space helped the mind handle influencing anything outside the metal walls of the ship. It could never come close to using a proper meditation chamber, however it was still better than nothing. More than enough to justify the risk. My awareness jumped forward and I got struck by how tired and on edge my crews were. Even if I knew it from the time I spent training them by experimenting with this power of mine, the sheer mental exhaustion that washed over me as I connected with my soldiers gave me pause. I gathered my wits and sent them reassurance and promise through our bond. We were almost home, I told them. We were almost safe and in place where we could rest. And this enemy force stood between us and respite. I guided their emotions, and soon my crews were gripped by cold, focused fury. They pushed their weariness aside and concentrated upon the enemy with a vengeance. The silencers and daggers spoke as one, and nearly a quarter of the Separatist munificence broke apart under energies they were never meant to endure. Concentrated fire began reaping through the rest, burning through shields, melting the comparatively light armor of those oversized frigates as if it was made of wax and biting deep within their decks. My ships maneuvered independently within our formation, instinctively aware where every one of their consorts was going. We flushed our remaining missiles as the enemy came closer, yet even that wasn't enough. I couldn't sense a single organic mind aboard the separatist ships. If they had a living commander, he or she died with one of the other Reaper elements. That was both a blessing and a curse. There was no one to influence on the other side, and at the same time, that fact significantly reduced the strain the battle meditation put upon my body and mind. The enemy threw everything they had got at my remaining silencers, and the cruisers that had them installed went into emergency deceleration, with the rest of the fleet maneuvering to place itself between them and the separatists. Damaged Venottas lost shields, cracked and abused armor failed, and decks got open to space. I felt it when hundreds of my people, then thousands, got sucked into hard vacuum where they were fried by radiation coming from fusion warheads or the magnetic fields shaping and containing turbolaser bolts. The lucky ones died when they passed too close to ordnance flying every which way. Others expired as corridors and compartments turned into their own personal crematoriums, or with pieces of broken decks tearing through them with contemptuous ease. The Hyperion became the next Venator to be rammed by the enemy, with a munificent catching her in the side at a bad angle that broke her spine. The forward third tore away with the rest of the ships, and the enemy frigate shredding themselves in series of bright explosions that culminated with a hypermatter reactor going critical and erasing them both from existence. At such a range, deflectors were close to useless, with ships often passing close enough that their shields interfered with each and stripped each other of power. Turbolasers, iron cannons and missiles hammered unprotected hulls at ranges sometimes shorter than the lengths of the ships themselves. This was the kinds of cauldron where fleets went to die, and this time it was no different. If it wasn't for the silencers, the best my battle meditation could have achieved would have been mutual annihilation. Yet we had the two remaining superweapons, and the fleet held cohesion thanks to my will for long enough that their capacitors recharged and they took aim. If it wasn't for the battle meditation, it would have been impossible to use them for effect in the melee, not without hitting our own ships too. With my power active and guiding everyone, a single stroke removed almost all remaining munificence. Only 3 frigates survived the silencers, and 2 of them got shot apart as they tried to close to one of them. The second, figuring out the impossibility of succeeding, redirected, and despite desperate last-ditch defensive fire, it managed to ram the rear of a Venator that stood its ground between the enemy and the silencer she protected. With the separatist frigates gone, we only had to deal with 5 intact battleships that slammed into our formation and began reducing my cruisers one after another. The remaining daggers crippled one, and soon my surviving Venottas put the battle wagon out of action. At such a close range, the other battleships managed to cripple most of my remaining fleet before the silencers recharged and, along with the daggers, caused enough damage to finally turn the tables. I slowly let go of the battle mediation along with the agony and screams of my wounded and dying crews. The strain and relief made me fall to one knee, panting for air. It was only then that our support ships finally arrived. Was it just 30 minutes that passed since we entered this system? It felt like a lifetime ago. Joanna, get what's left of the fleet to assume defensive positions around the supply ships and get us to Giza ASAP. Be advised that we still might have one last fight on our hands before getting to safety. I took a deep rasping breath. And give me a status update once you've got it. I looked at the tactical plot. Less than a fifth of the ships I entered Lantilles with were still designated as space-worthy, and all were freshly damaged to some extent. In fact, the escorts detached to guard the supply ships both outnumbered us and would outgun us if it wasn't for the 2 silencers we managed to preserve. I grimaced. There was no way in hell I could bring this fleet in another battle unless I absolutely had to. Liberating Mandalore with it? That was out of the question. Now that bloody vision from before Bothoi made even more sense. If we had to fight our way through all enemy forces at Rondon, I doubted we would have had any fleet to bring home. Even now, most of the remaining fleet might still die if we ran into the separatist force commander Nabi warned us about. Once we got to Tanab, I had to figure out how to beg, borrow and swindle my way into command of a force that could liberate Mandalore. =RK=, Interlude, Historical Notes, =RK=, Professor, what is your explanation on why the Republic's political collapse and refusal to fight during what is now commonly known as the second phase of the Clone Wars? This myth really needs to die. What do you mean? The Republic, at least its military in the face of the GAR, never ceased fighting the Separatists. Even at the height of the infighting that engulfed the Corps. That in fact is the best explanation I can give. This perception is a very Corps-centric thing that has been a source of resentment for decades now. Yes, after Corellia and Kuat, the Separatists ceased their major operations in the Corps. They concentrated on fortifying their positions in a rough line from Duro to Kamena. The GAR and various SDFs in turn made places like Perma, Fedel and Katada into fortresses backed by massive mobile forces. Of course, Kuat was in a league of its own with almost all-star dreadnoughts and battlecruisers the Republic possessed concentrated in a single system. Still, fighting on that front never really ceased, with at least 2 sector fleet equivalents dispersed and raiding on both sides ever since Corellia fell. However, there were no sweeping offensives or counteroffensives. No real estate changed hands on that front for months, only raids aimed to disrupt the enemy. That's certainly less interesting than the circus ongoing on Coruscant, and that was before Chancellor Kenobi got elected and the excitement that followed. I can't really dispute that fact. Everyone watched the events on Coruscant with bated breath. Everyone, at least in the Corps, apparently forgot that while politicians bickered on Coruscant, in the east, the fighting never really ceased on a front that was more than 10,000 years long and hundreds to thousands of light years deep. It was there where fleets and armies went to die in that quiet period when the Republic didn't fight. Do you know that more than 60% of completed Republic naval construction since the fall of Corellia was sent to the east to replace ongoing losses? From Keithum to Jan Farthel, from Ord Mantell to Geonassa, from Coruscant to Mercia and Mandalore, from Alpharides to Tanab and the thousands of worlds in the sectors between them. There wasn't a day since Corellia's fall that didn't see hundreds of active space battles, often dozens of worlds swapping hands. There were whole regions like the Dead Zone between Ord Mantell and Geonassa where the front line repeatedly shifted for hundreds of light years as reinforcements became available to one side or the other. The Republic never stopped fighting, yet the Corps didn't really care for most of those places. Between the fall of Lantilles and its liberation after General Vale smashed the Separatist naval forces when he returned to friendly space, almost none of those countless battles were deemed important enough to make the news. Chancellor Palpatine's ghost exposing the Senate's dirty laundry, the controversial way Chancellor Kenobi got elected, the number of secessions that followed, a large number of clones going rogue that led to infighting on Coruscant and a number of other worlds in the Corps, the Separatist propaganda about General Vale's actions that culminated with Bothawui, those were the news everyone was interested in. Who cared about fighting above some planet they hadn't heard of, nor could they figure out in what sector of the galaxy it happened? People were more interested in what happened closer to home. That was of course true for the citizens in the Mid-Rim and the expansion regions too. For them, the troubles on Coruscant and the constitutional crisis kicked up by Chancellor Kenobi's controversial election were distant things. They seldom mattered. People on the front lines or close to them didn't care what problems the senators on Coruscant had. All they wanted was for the Republic to fulfill its mandate and protect them. That's a most fascinating revelation. What are you basing your conclusions upon? I've interviewed a lot of people in places like Ord Mantell, Corsa, even Mandalore for my documentary series. Nowadays, we have access to recently declassified military and government archives from the Clone Wars era, and all of them support my conclusions. Reading through them, it becomes painfully clear why the Republic faltered during its darkest hour. The people and politicians on Coruscant, Kuat, Anaxes and all the other major centers of power in the Corps, they had very different interests and agendas from each other, the Republic as a whole, not to mention the governments in the Mid-Rim and expansion regions. It was an even starker contrast when you compare them to what worlds in the outer colonies and Rim cared about. Certainly, there were many people intellectually supporting the Republic, believing in it. It was an ideal that brought us a golden age. Yet in practical terms, even before the war, in day-to-day interactions, local interests and agendas superseded any loyalty that governments had towards the Republic. They and their senators supported its interests when it suited them, and more often than not, unless it was a political suicide, they would back and push for policies that benefited their worlds, systems and alliances, even if that came at the price of weakening the Republic as a whole. That's what people even today somehow fail to understand deep down, even if they know it intellectually. More often than not, the interests of the Republic as a whole clashed with those of many member states. Senators and local governments, their job was never to push for what was best for the Republic. Instead, it was to do their damn best to work for the interests of their citizens, even if that meant that their neighbors and the Republic as a whole would be in an inferior position as a result. The Republic, the Senate, they were always a carefully balanced act. Further, and this is very important, before Chancellor Palpatine came to power, it has been hundreds of years since anyone in a position of power within the core would suffer someone in his post wielding real power. While not a figurehead, the position of Chancellor had been limited by design, and through it, what the Senate and Republic could wield in practical terms. No major government was ever comfortable with Coruscant dictating to them what they should do, and many of them spent the centuries following the Rusan Reformation slowly changing the Senate and the Republic to better serve their interests. It was a testament to Chancellor Palpatine's political skills, charisma, personal connections and the turbulent times when he arose to power that he was allowed to actually lead the Republic. The Republic we knew was never meant to operate with someone in his position having so much power. It was an unprecedented event, and once he was assassinated, with no clear acceptable successor, the system broke. Legally, the next Chancellor would have had the same powers Palpatine wielded at the height of his power. They would need them to prosecute the war, yet no one could be trusted with such a power. Palpatine had the trust and ear of many local governments. Without it, he could have never pushed for the reforms that gave him the power he needed to fight the war. It was not so for any potential successor, which explains how the Senate ground to a halt for over a month after the Jedi's attempted coup. This is in part how the myth of the Republic not fighting after Corellia was born. Everyone in the core had their eyes on Coruscant. Many were afraid that no matter who the next Chancellor would be, they would push the agendas of their local governments to the detriment of everyone else. The most likely candidate to succeed Palpatine was seen as a puppet of Kuat, electing him as capitulating to Quati interests and turning the whole Republic as their vassals in practice if not in name. It was that same fear combined with the history between Mandalore and the rest of the galaxy that tore the Republic apart when Chancellor Satine was finally elected, and once again events in the core overshadowed the war at large. Transcript from a GNN interview with famous history author Mer Kilex.